Greetings, bibliophiles, and welcome back to The Book Thing. I've managed to fall a bit behind with this. In the space since the last video, I've actually finished not one, not two, but 3 books. One of them I was already in the process of reading at that point, of course, but then I've finished 2 since then as well. So I'm going to be doing this video at probably a slightly more brisk clip than usual. I don't think I'll be reading out bits as I normally do, just to try and cut down on the time a little bit. So first off is the debut novel by Louis de Bernières, which was published in 1990 something. I think it was the early 90s. The War of Donna Manuals Nether Parts. Now I've read a couple of de Bernières' other novels, including his third published novel, and those first 3 novels actually form a kind of a loose trilogy known as the Latin American trilogy. I had not realised that there was this kind of connection going on, but it kind of, having read now 2 of those 3, it sort of makes slightly more sense in my head. They're not directly connected. It's not a narrative trilogy, but it's a trilogy in the sense of the locations are similar, the themes are similar, the evocation is similar, and he is and it really shines through the 2 I've read, and I'm sure the third one as well. He is a massive fanboy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he pretty much in the third one, was it Señor Vivo and the Coca Lords? He basically name checks Macondo from 100 Years of Solitude. So he basically fesses up in the book. But even if, it's kind of obvious. It's kind of obvious, but he does basically admit it himself. And even if he didn't admit it himself, you would just have to read the books to know that he is a big fan of Marquez. So there is a very, for these 3 anyway, I'm presuming the third one's the same. There's a kind of very Marquez magical realism feel to them, and he actually does an interesting thing. I mean, it's a very deliberate thing, and it's just reading through the War of Donna Manuals Nether Parts, you wouldn't guess that this was somebody's first novel. It's a really accomplished first published novel, but he creates this rather dreamlike atmosphere about the whole thing. And then he does a really interesting thing about halfway through the book. He has this one chapter where he just kind of punctures it. He puts in this really kind of almost mundane, grounded chapter that is presented in the form of a letter. And it's just, it kind of, you don't really realise up until that point maybe quite how dreamlike the whole thing has been. And then he kind of comes along with this, it's like dropping a leaden weight through I don't even know what kind of imagery I'm going for there, but it really highlights what the rest of it is. And it's a really clever bit of I don't even know what to call it. It's a clever bit of something. The novel itself is structured not entirely unlike a book I've previously covered, Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner. And in that I talked about how it takes all these small chapters and builds them up into a mosaic picture. And he does that, Louis de Bernières does that in this novel as well. There's more connection, there's less kind of side branches, as it were. There's less stuff that's in there just to illustrate the world, and there's basically multiple plot lines going on. He introduces a whole bunch of characters, and you dip in and out of what these characters are doing, and a lot of them end up interacting with each other, even if they don't realise they're interacting with each other. But there's also some quite nice kind of character arcs going on in there as well, including some characters that change in quite surprising ways. So yeah, it's maybe a little confusing at first trying to keep track of who is who, but he does quite a good job of differentiating. And whereas there was really 3-ish main plot strands to Stand on Zanzibar, this has more going on in it, and it ends up being quite a kind of a colourful book. It's full of life and death and everything in between, and some of it's comic, some of it is occasionally horrible, but it never loses that kind of dreamlike quality that really makes it stand out as something a bit different. So I do recommend this, and I also recommend the other one that I've read of his that I got all the way through, I should add, because there's a little caveat to that. The Signor Vivo and the Coca Lord. I did start reading another one of his called The Partisan's Daughter, or A Partisan's Daughter, or something like that. Couldn't finish it, and that was more... I don't know, I just couldn't get into it. It was a very different sort of a novel than the other two that I've read. I maybe at some point will try Captain Corelli's Mandolin. That is, of course, the one that de Bernières is most famous for. But his first three novels are well worth checking out. Next, we come to Ringworld by Larry Niven, and this is widely regarded as one of the classics of sci-fi over the last couple of decades, and rightly so. It is an exceptionally good sci-fi novel. Now, this was published in, I want to say 1971. I could be wrong about that. Possibly 1970. It was around about then, anyway. So, we're more or less in the New Wave era. But interestingly, although a lot of New Wave sci-fi maybe seems a bit dated these days. I mean, it's the stuff I basically grew up reading. It's not like I was born in that era. It's just there was a lot of that kind of sci-fi around the house where I was growing up. And so I read a lot of novels that were very, very New Wave. And this is interesting because it kind of half is and half isn't. It has a lot of... it's definitely moved on from a lot of the sci-fi of even just, say, a decade and a half, 2 decades beforehand. But there's a lot about it that seems terribly modern as well. And it's, I think, fair to say that this has been a very influential book in its kind of outlook, in its scale, in its ideas. This is a book, the Ringworld, the titular Ringworld, is basically... as it describes it, it's a compromise between a Dyson sphere and something that's a little more practical, a little more economic. Now, there's another sci-fi novel, and I can't remember the name of it, and it's been bugging me, but it does, in fact, have a Dyson sphere in it. And the idea of a Dyson sphere is that it's this shell built around a star. Now, that is big, unimaginably big. I mean, stars are pretty big to begin with. Stars are basically the largest single stellar objects that there are. I mean, you could say there are bigger things like nebulas and whatever, but in terms of individual masses, stars are the biggest. Black holes, actually, having said that, stars are biggest. Black holes might be bigger, and black holes will certainly be the more massier stellar objects. But anyway, I'm getting completely off track here. Basically, to have something that goes around a star, you need a really big structure. Now, the idea of a Dyson sphere is that you would build this far enough away from the star that on the inside you basically have a habitable zone. And so you've got atmosphere and you've got more space than you could ever possibly need. Now, what Niven did was imagine, well, what if you didn't build a sphere? What if you just had a single strip around a star? And it's still a huge amount of land, but it's something on a slightly less crazy scale. Now, this is obviously where all the action of Ringworld takes place. The protagonist, Louis Wu, and his band of adventurers end up stuck there. Now, it's not their intention to go there, but they end up there, and it's basically... in some ways, it's a sort of an old-fashioned sci-fi adventure. They crash land, and they've got to survive and try and escape. So in that regard, it's relatively straightforward. But there's a lot of stuff going on in the background as well, particularly to do with the interaction between the characters in the party, the interaction between the species that they represent, and just the kind of the background of the politics of the universe as given in this novel as well. So it's a really well-written book. It's really interesting story-wise, and in terms of being an adventure story, it's a real page-turner. I think I went through this in well less than a week. It only took me 5-6 days to get through it. I mean, it's not like it's a particularly huge book anyway, but it's got that quality where you just keep reading, you just keep, you want to know what's going to happen next. This one, by the way, I read before. I should maybe have said the de Bernières novel. That was the first time I'd read that, even though I've read him before. Ringworld is one from my shelf where I have read it before, but it was many moons ago. So it was nice to revisit it and come back to those half-remembered... it's always like that when you come back to a book you've not read for a while. You've got these little half-remembered scenes in your head, and you come to that bit of the book and you go, oh yeah, that's what happened there. So there we go, Ringworld. Definitely recommended. If you're a fan of sci-fi in general and you haven't read Ringworld, I think it's one you kind of need to go and read. It's regarded as a classic for a very good reason, and it doesn't really feel dated in the same way that some of that sci-fi of that era does. Lastly, we come to something that's really much more up-to-date. Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which was, I believe, published last year. Now, from what I can tell, he is someone who's written a bunch of fantasy novels, but this is his first venture into science fiction. And this one caught my eye, actually. This is something, it represents something I rarely do. I bought it without knowing anything about it or anything about the author from a local bookshop on the island, and I don't do that very often. Most of the time, if it's something new, it's from the library, or else it might be something from one of the charity shops, and in which case, 50 pence, a pound, whatever, it's not much to, if I don't enjoy it very much, I can just return it, it's fine. But in this case, this was a brand new copy. There's not a lot of sci-fi in that particular shop, that particular bookshop, so it caught my eye just on that alone. And then I looked at it and looked at the blurb and thought, this actually kind of looks interesting. And the risk paid off. It was actually pretty damn decent. So where do I start with this? Basically, it is a book about what if we didn't meet aliens, but what if we met life that was still alien to us, even though it wasn't aliens. That probably sounds a bit vague, but maybe it'll make more sense if I explain the premise of the book. It starts off in the far future, and we don't have an exact date given, but it could be hundreds of years from now. It could be, like a millennia from now. And basically, we open onto humanity's first extraterrestrial terraforming project. Humanity is spread out to the stars, or at least they've spread out over the solar system. It makes that clear. And in looking to colonize, inhabit other worlds, clearly, it doesn't say exactly, but the subtext is they haven't really found many habitable worlds that are nearby. There's no FTL travel in this, by the way. Everybody has to slog along under the speed of light. And so we start off, is it something like 20 light years from Earth? I can't remember exactly. It's at the first planet, anyway, that's been successfully terraformed. Now, the idea is, and it's a bit of it seems a bit of an odd premise, but you just kind of have to go with it. The idea is that they've seeded this terraformed Earth-like world with various kind of life. They've basically given it an ecosystem. And what they're going to do is they're going to deposit monkeys on the surface, and then they're going to use an engineered virus to uplift, to engineer those monkeys to eventual sentience. Now, given enough time, that might have happened anyway, but this is meant to accelerate the whole process vastly. The idea is that when humanity arrives en masse to actually properly colonize the planet, they will have this uplifted monkey sort of subservient species, or so they hope, to have built some infrastructure for them, to have developed to a stage where maybe they've already started to industrialize a bit, and so they'll have prepared the ground, basically. It won't just be humans turning up and having to do everything. Now, it maybe sounds a bit kind of odd, but it's, that's the setup, and it's one of these times when you think, this, why would people do that? Why wouldn't they just turn up and, but I guess it's supposed to be within the context of the novel that the politics of the era would mean people wouldn't want to or something. I don't know exactly. Anyway, as we rapidly discover, however, human society is not exactly at ease with itself and at ease with the idea of pushing outwards. And it's a theme that's been used in other novels. You've got, a kind of conservative element or an element of humanity that just push back against this idea that feel that we're going too far, that we're going out too fast or whatever. And such is the political situation of Earth that this results in a massive civil war. Earth's colonies, the in-solar system colonies, are basically all destroyed outright because they haven't terraformed anything in the solar system. It's all colonies that rely on sealed domes, habitats and whatever. And so without life support, people, even the ones that don't get outright destroyed in the civil war or the conflict that ensues, they still eventually just die because they're not self-sustaining colonies. Earth itself, totally wrecked. There's this. It's not really stated whether it's nuclear or biological or whether other weapons involved, but Earth just eats itself, basically. Meanwhile, at the terraformed planet, this uprising, whatever, has been coordinated. So it happens everywhere at the same time, which I'm not sure if that makes any sense in the context of being 20 light years distant. But basically, the project to seed this life, or to seed the monkeys and the uplift virus and all that, the project ship gets blown up by a fanatic, but the lead scientist of Rana Kern just about manages to escape, because part of the project was that they were going to have somebody left in orbit to monitor things in a kind of a smart pod thing, and they'd be in cryogenic sleep until such time as the pod woke them up and said, hey, the monkeys are doing interesting things. So she gets left around this planet, and we fast forward nearly 2,000 years. And it's a bit of a jump. We get through that first section at quite a clip. And at that point, the real story begins, because what we find ourselves with is the remnants of humanity. We're told that various arc ships have been constructed. I mean, humanity has basically clawed its way up over these last 2 millennia, and somehow they've managed to start to rebuild a society. But crucially, in the intervening time, there was an ice age on Earth, and the ice age recedes, and all of the horrible, toxic whatever that had been used in this civil war then starts spewing out into the environment, and at that point, they just have to abandon Earth. And again, you just kind of have to go with it a little bit. So we're on one of these arc ships, basically, and they're traveling towards this terraformed planet, because a big part of their society has been trying to rediscover the technologies of the ancients, the Imperials, as they call them, and discover what they can discover. And it's, generally speaking, hazardous business. A lot of these things were booby-trapped, or they're just not safe anyway, and so it's generally speaking considered like the knowledge of the ancients is kind of quite hard won. But they've been able to gather enough to be able to make these interstellar capable ships. However, they travel a lot slower than the ships of humanity in its heyday. So they're heading towards the terraformed planet, because it's one of the bits of information they had was the locations of some of these terraformed planets. And it basically kicks off from there, because what's happened in the meantime, and we've got 2 strands of the story, basically. We've got the Ark ship as told through the eyes of Holston Mason, or is it Mason Holston? I never get it right in my head, either way. One of those 2 is the dude's name. He's the ship's classicist, he's called. He's basically a historian / linguist. And his job is, if they encounter any ancient technology, he's the one that has to translate all the anything that might come from it and try and figure out what it was for. So they turn up, and this pod that's left over, containing Avrana Kern, she's kind of gone a bit crazy, and it's a bit unclear because she kind of uploads a personality to the computer systems of the pod, and then over time, apparently everything just kind of merges together, and then it becomes unclear what is the smart AI of the pod and what is left of Avrana Kern. Basically, she's a bit crazy after nearly 2 millennia, and she won't let them land. Now, crucially, one point that I haven't mentioned is that the super evolution virus got to the planet. The monkeys didn't. And again, this is a point where you just have to go, okay, I'm just going to go with it. The scientists that designed the virus had designed it so that it would only interact with primates, so it would only interact with the monkeys. Except apparently they'd have a massive oversight in that they hadn't thought to check if it would interact with any invertebrates. And as it turns out, it does. And so various of the lower life forms that this planet had been seeded with have started to evolve. And particularly it picks out a species of spider. And so these spiders start to evolve. And this is the other strand of the story. So at the time of the first encounter, when they get to this planet for the first time, they don't... Like, the spiders have evolved quite far, but not that far. And then it kind of sets up at that point a conflict because I don't want to go over the entire plot, but essentially it comes down to at the end of the novel where humanity has no choice. This planet is their only option, and so it sets up this inevitable kind of showdown between the spiders and the people. Now, thematically, there's some maybe slightly clunky bits going on with the plot, but thematically it's quite interesting, because this is all in a universe where humans have spread out a little bit, and, clearly they didn't get that far. They'd only colonized within the solar system. This was their first kind of attempt terraforming these planets, terraforming one planet and starting to terraform some others. This was their attempt to finally start spreading out, and then, of course, disaster struck. But during that time, and in all the ages since, there's been no hint of alien anything. So it kind of, with the spiders evolving into something intelligent, sentient, it sort of asks, well, if life came along, if it was alien to us, would it still necessarily be alien? Because, of course, the spiders are all too horribly familiar to the crew of the Gilgamesh, as the ship is called. And there's this whole thing, because they keep there's quite a time span in this book. One of the ways they keep bringing the same characters back is they go into suspended animation for very long periods of time, and so you'll see different characters aging at different rates, and there's this idea of immortality gets sprinkled in there, hence the ship being called the Gilgamesh, I guess. But yeah, it just sets up this conflict and this disbelief. And of course, the humans arriving on the Ark ship, they don't know anything about Avrana Kern's project. They don't know anything about the virus. They just know they've turned up on this planet initially, and there's all these oversized bugs on it. And it's only kind of later on when the realization dawns on them that these are more than just mere bugs. So it's interesting more than, compared to Ringworld. Ringworld's a classic, and this is still very good. Weaknesses in the plot aside. Once I got to that maybe second half of the novel or so, where they really start to, the pressure starts to get ramped up a bit, and that kind of feeling that this is make or break for humanity, that if they don't do this, if they don't try, even though it might be completely hopeless, then they're possibly just done anyway. It starts, once it picks up that pace, I got through the second half of the novel, I think, quite a lot quicker than I got through the first half. It's just one of those books. So overall, pretty good. I think I'd recommend that. And I'll be keeping my eye out for other books by Adrian Tchaikovsky at this point as well, because he's clearly not a bad writer, and there are some fairly interesting ideas going on here. So there we are. I will try not to leave it so long next time. I mean, part of the reason why there was such a gap is I ended up having a bit of a break on my main gaming channel anyway, and so I've just managed to get a little bit behind. But now I'm up to date, at least with books. There's maybe one or two shows on Netflix that I want to cover as well, but we'll see. There's one I'm pushing to get finished at the moment. There's another one I'm just steadily working my way through. And then there's a third one which I've finished watching not that long ago, but it would be maybe a little bit difficult to talk about, but maybe I'll try anyway, if that makes any sense. Well, it probably doesn't at this point, but it might do when I actually sit down and try and do a video. So that's all for now. Hopefully you have enjoyed this roundup of the last couple of books I've read. And if you have, you can leave any comments below. You can hit the like button. You can sub to my channel if you haven't already. And as always, stay tuned for more.